November 24, 1326. The town square of Hereford, England, is overflowing with people. Nobles in fine cloaks, clergymen clutching rosaries. Tradesmen, peasants. They've all gathered for one reason, to witness a moment of brutal public justice. Raised high above the crowd is a wooden platform. At its center, guards drag forth a man in his early 40s. His face is hollow and pale. He's been starving himself for days in a desperate bid to avoid what's coming. His once luxurious clothes hang off him in filthy tatters. Just a few years ago, this man had been the most powerful figure in England, after the king himself. Today he's about to be executed in one of the most gruesome ways imaginable. His name is Hugh Despencer the Younger, royal favorite and possible lover of King Edward II. Within hours, his body will be torn apart in front of a cheering crowd. A warning to anyone who flies too close to power without watching their back. But to understand how Hugh ended up on this scaffold, we need to rewind. His rise and his fall is a story soaked in ambition, power plays, betrayal, and scandal that rocked the kingdom to its core. Hugh Despencer the Younger was born around 1286 into one of England's most prominent noble families. His father, Hugh Despencer the Elder, was a trusted servant of King Edward I. His mother, Isabel Beauchamp, came from the powerful Earl of Warwick's bloodline. Hugh had every advantage a medieval aristocrat could dream of: status, education, and access to court. From the start, he was raised to serve the crown and secure his family's influence. Everything changed in 1307 when Edward II became king. Edward had a reputation, one that raised eyebrows among the nobility. His deep affections for male favorites were no secret. And his first companion, Piers Gaveston, stirred outrage across the kingdom. Gaveston wasn't just close to Edward. He was arrogant, dismissive of the nobility, and seemed to flaunt his power. The situation boiled over, and in 1312, the barons took matters into their own hands. Gaveston was captured and brutally executed. That left a vacuum beside the king, and Hugh Despencer was ready to step in. By 1316, Hugh had wormed his way into the king's inner circle. He was appointed royal chamberlain, a role that gave him constant private access to Edward. Their bond deepened quickly. Hugh also shored up his position by marrying Eleanor de Clare, the king's niece. Through her, he gained the lush and powerful lordship of Gleorgan in Wales. As Hugh's influence over Edward grew, so did his appetite for land, for power, and for control. He wasn't content with what he had. He wanted more. And thanks to the king's favor, he could get it. Hugh began exploiting his royal access to seize estates across England and Wales. He manipulated the law to confiscate lands from rivals, even from widows and his own in-laws. He wasn't subtle. He wasn't fair. And he made enemies fast. In 1321, things came to a head. Fed up with his corruption and unchecked greed, the barons rebelled. Hugh was forced into exile. But even then, he refused to fade quietly. He turned to piracy. Yes, piracy. Raiding English merchant ships while abroad. But Hugh wouldn't stay gone for long. Edward II, determined to crush the rebellion, regained control by 1322. With the king back in power, Hugh returned, more powerful and ruthless than ever. From 1322 to 1326. The Despensers, father and son, didn't just serve the crown, they were the crown. Hugh the Younger controlled access to Edward, dictated policy, and ran the kingdom like his personal estate. Chronicler Jean Fizar wrote that Hugh was king in all but name. And he wasn't wrong. What made things even more volatile, though, were the whispers. Rumors that Hugh's relationship with Edward was more than political. Hugh had a wife and children, yes, but people at court suspected he was also the king's lover. In medieval England, such a charge wasn't just scandalous, it was dangerous. Back then, same-sex relationships were labeled sodomy, a grave sin in the eyes of the church and a crime against both nature and divine order. Whether the accusations were true or not didn't matter. The rumor alone was enough to poison Hugh's image further and fuel his downfall. Queen Isabella, Edward II's wife, was especially embittered by Hugh's presence. The daughter of the French king, Isabella had once held considerable sway at court, but Hugh had sidelined her entirely. Over the years, her influence, her access to funds, and even her children slipped away thanks to Hugh. In 1324, Hugh crossed a dangerous line. He stripped Isabella of her lands. He jailed her household staff, and most shockingly, he removed her children from her custody and handed them to his own wife, Eleanor. Isabella had endured enough. In 1325, she was sent to France to negotiate a peace deal on behalf of England. But she had other plans. There in Paris, she met Roger Mortimer, a powerful English baron who had escaped the Tower of London after opposing Hugh, and fled into exile. The two became lovers, and soon co-conspirators in a plot to push deeper into Wales, but the walls were closing in. Starved of support, pursued by an army of enemies, they were finally captured near Neath. The king, once the ruler of a mighty realm, was taken into custody. In a matter of weeks, he would be forced to give up his crown to his 14-year-old son, the future Edward III. But Hugh's fate would be far worse. Knowing what was coming, Hugh tried to escape his fate in the only way left to him. He stopped eating, a slow suicide, hoping to waste away before his enemies could reach him. But it didn't work. By mid-November, still alive, but weak and skeletal, he was dragged back across the border and taken to Hereford. There, on November 24, Hugh stood trial in front of his fiercest enemies, Roger Mortimer, Queen Isabella, and a tribunal of barons who had suffered under his reign. But the trial was nothing more than theater. The outcome had been decided long before he was ever captured. The charges were long and damning: treason, theft, extortion, manipulation of the king, corruption. The tribunal made sure to dress the whole process up as legal. They wanted this to look like justice, not just revenge. But everyone knew what this really was. Hugh Despenser the Younger was found guilty on all counts, and his sentence was unlike anything England had ever seen. That morning, a massive crowd flooded the market square in Hereford. Everyone wanted to witness the spectacle. This wasn't just an execution. It was a show, a message, and a moment of public catharsis. Isabella was there. So was Mortimer. Nobles, soldiers, townsfolk, people came from miles around. They wanted to see the mighty brought low, and Hugh Despenser was about to be brought very low. First, he was tied to a tall ladder, raised high so all could see. A crown made of nettles was shoved onto his head, mocking the influence he'd once held beside the king. Verses from the Bible were scrolled across his bare skin, denouncing arrogance and evil. Then the torture began. According to chroniclers like Jean Fraser, the executioners cut off Hugh's genitals and threw them into a fire in front of his eyes, a punishment chosen deliberately to symbolize and condemn the alleged sodomy with King Edward. The crowd jeered. Some laughed. Others roared with approval. But it wasn't over. Still alive, Hugh was gutted. His abdomen was sliced open, and his entrails were slowly pulled out, then burned. The square echoed with what witnesses called a howl unlike any human sound. It was a sound of agony, of horror, of a man being torn apart while fully conscious. Only after this long torment was Hugh finally hanged, but even then his humiliation wasn't complete. His body was beheaded, then quartered. His limbs were sent to be displayed in cities across the kingdom, public reminders of what happens to those who overreach. His head was placed atop a spike at London's gates, a grim warning to all who passed by. But why such cruelty? Why such theatrical violence? This wasn't just punishment. This was symbolism. Hugh's execution was crafted to be a moral spectacle, an expiation of sins that the people believed had polluted the kingdom. His public castration wasn't just about physical pain. It was about shame, about broadcasting a message. This man violated sacred bonds, corrupted royal power, and defiled the natural order. It was also revenge, sweet and bloody, for the countless nobles, widows, and commoners Hugh had cheated and crushed during his reign. 4 years later, in 1330, Hugh's widow, Eleanor de Clare, received permission to gather what was left of his body and bury it. But by then little remained. A head, a thigh bone, a few scattered fragments. It was a pitiful burial for a man who had once ruled England from behind the throne. As for Edward II, his story didn't end much better. At first, he was held in captivity. But in September 1327, less than a year after Hugh's execution, Edward died at Berkeley Castle under mysterious circumstances. The most persistent and macabre legend is that he was murdered by having a red-hot poker inserted into his rectum, a horrifying method that would leave no visible wounds, but served as a grim reference to his rumored relationship with Hugh. Whether or not that account is true, the symbolism of the tale is telling. Like Hugh, Edward's death was laced with poetic cruelty designed to humiliate, to erase, and to cleanse the kingdom of what many believed was moral rot. The fall of Hugh Despenser the Younger wasn't just a political collapse. It was a national purge. In the eyes of his enemies, his body had to be mutilated, burned, scattered. Not just to destroy the man, but to erase what he represented. His power, his greed, his closeness to the king, his rumored sexuality. For medieval England, that wasn't just scandal. It was a crisis. But here's the twist. The very people who brought him down, Queen Isabella and Roger Mortimer, would soon suffer the same fate. Just 4 years after Hugh's grisly end, the political will turned once again. In 1330, the young King Edward III, just 17 years old, seized control of his own crown. Mortimer, who had ruled England through the Queen as a de facto regent, was arrested. Unlike Hugh, he was spared the slow torture, but not the noose. Mortimer was hanged as a traitor. Isabella, once the avenging queen, was removed from power and quietly placed under house arrest. Her glorious revenge had been short-lived. Power in medieval England, it seemed, always came with a ticking clock. And yet, nearly 700 years later, the story of Hugh Despenser still grips the imagination. In a recent poll, he was voted the greatest British villain of the 14th century, outranking even kings and generals. His name shows up in plays, novels, and television dramas. Often cast as the perfect archetype of the conniving courtier, ambitious, arrogant, and ultimately doomed. But modern historians tell a more complex story. Yes, Hugh was ruthless. He was greedy. He used his influence over Edward II to amass obscene wealth and crush his rivals. Even in the harsh context of medieval politics, he stood out as a man with few scruples and fewer allies. His actions, like exiling his enemies, stealing lands, and even imprisoning the Queen's household, won him enemies at every level of society. But not every political weapon. It wasn't necessarily about truth. It was about shame and control. Many historians believe that the charges of homosexuality against Hugh and Edward II were exaggerated or even invented to justify their removal and humiliate them in the public eye. Homophobia in the Middle Ages wasn't just cultural. It was strategic. If you could brand a rival as sexually deviant, you could erase their legacy, devalue their alliances, and rally public rage. For Hugh and Edward, that rage became their undoing. Their story reveals something deeper about medieval justice. Executions like Hugh's weren't just about punishment. They were performances. Each step of his death, castration, burning, hanging, beheading, was packed with symbolism, tailored to strike fear, cleanse sin, and restore a shaken moral order. It wasn't enough to kill the man. The body had to be turned into a message. And that message was loud and clear. This is what happens when someone grabs too much power. This is what happens when someone disrupts the natural hierarchy. This is what happens to those who dare to mix personal desire with political authority. But perhaps the most haunting lesson of Hugh Dispenser's story is that these dynamics aren't relics of a forgotten age. Today, we still grapple with the messy entanglement of power and favoritism. We still see the rise and fall of elites. We still watch as powerful people are built up and torn down, often under the weight of their own ambition. And we still live in societies where sexuality, especially when politicized, can be weaponized to discredit and destroy. Hugh's story is shocking, not just because of its brutality, but because of how familiar it feels. He rose fast. He flew too close to the sun. And when he fell, it wasn't just a defeat. It was a spectacle. A lesson carved into flesh. Played out before thousands and echoed for centuries. From a privileged noble boy to the shadow ruler of England, from royal chamberlain to castrated traitor, from a name spoken in awe to one remembered with a shudder. The rise and fall of Hugh Dispenser is one of the most violent and revealing chapters in English history. His name may be long buried, his bones scattered, but the story of what he became and what the world did to him remains a chilling reflection of the dark edges of politics, sexuality, and revenge. A story that even today still whispers its warning. Power is never free and history never forgets.